Let's take a look at how we can get more out of our Harbor Freight Chicago Electric 10-inch sliding miter saw. One of the first considerations is stability. So as you can see here, I've actually bolted mine down to a 24 by 48 inch piece of plywood, and then I have secured it to my Workmate 425, which weighs about 35 pounds. So what that does is gives me a great deal of stability. If you don't have a Workmate, you might want to bolt it on to another workbench or something like that. Clamp it down just to make sure it's secure. One of the areas that we tend to overlook with power tools is electricity and the power coming through. The cord on the right is the power cord that leads directly into the saw. And then the yellow one that you see here is a really old power cord or extension cord that I just out of convenience plugged my saw into and started cutting some 4x4s. And at first I thought I had a problem with the saw because there was that much less power. And after a couple of cuts I realized, oh, I put it into a very old extension cord. Once I plugged it into my better extension cord, it made a significant difference. It was very noticeable. So make sure that you have a 16 gauge or better power cord for your miter saw. Many times you'll find yourself making shorter cuts on your lumber in such a fashion that the longer piece is really off-center to that little support, that little arm that you see right there. So what you may want to do is find a block that you can extend out on your table or bench, whatever you're using to support this, so that when you make your cut, it doesn't tilt and you're not relying on your hands to hold it in place. You can place your hand back here to stabilize it, and you're keeping your hand further away from the saw. So think about getting a series of blocks to stabilize your work. I recently had to cut some shelving, so I did several things to support it correctly. Number one, I used my roller stand over here on this side, as you can see right there. And then I was really concerned because I didn't want this part of this panel tilting down that way after I made the cut and then causing a problem back up here in ripping or tearing when I made the final inch or so of cut. So what I ended up doing is taking some of my support blocks and putting them underneath here. And that solved that problem because I made a smaller cut earlier where I was taking about an inch off and it really did not behave well. I had to recut because of the way it tore off. So what you can do in those cases is put some additional support blocks underneath so you can make this cut. Now this happens to be a 16-inch board, I believe, and I'll show you how I can cut that in a little bit. One of the features that this miter saw has is if you can see that little yellow knob up at the top and then the bolt that's coming down through, that is a stop mechanism that stops right down here, stops right there. So you flip this out and then when you bring your saw down, it stops it in place, and what that does is that prevents your saw from going any further down than you want it to go. So if you want to do some dados or rabbets, you can then adjust this yellow knob right there so that that screw comes down and hits that stop right there. Okay? I use my leaf blower to clean off my miter saw, but sometimes I forget to come back here and clean off these stabilizing shafts that you see here. And what I like to do now, I try to remember, is just take a simple dry cloth and wipe those down because obviously they're sliding in and out of this housing back and forth, and you want to keep that as clean as possible. So make sure you clean it off on this side and then on this side as well so it maintains a good clean surface. If you're doing an awful lot of cutting, you may find that you're going to experience a certain amount of buildup of resin on your blade. I don't have a lot here because I haven't done that much cutting. And that can have a tendency to reduce the cutting efficiency of your blade. So if you see an awful lot of residue down there and your blade is not cutting right, before you go sharpening the blade or tossing it out and getting another one, you might want to think about getting some saw blade cleaner and cleaning that blade up. Another aspect of stability is this little bolt right here. You want to make sure that's just touching down on your work surface so that it helps stabilize this slider right here. So make sure you've got that down. It's just touching the surface and it'll give you a little bit more stability. I had to cut some 4x4 for a potting bench I was making. And when I laid it up against the back, you notice even though I cut as best I could, I still had a little bit of splintering going on here. So what I did was I ended up taking a piece of wood back here, a sacrificial piece, and then put this flush up against it. And from that point on, when I cut, I didn't have that problem anymore. This is a good little hold down clamp. However, you'll find that if you position it as I have here, it's going to block your miter saw from completing the cut. So let's watch what happens. I'm going to bring this down, and as you can see, it bumps into the housing for the motor. So right there it stops. It doesn't allow you to go all the way through. So if you decide to use this, you need clamping on this side, and you decide to use it, make sure you don't position it so that it's in the way of the motor housing. Of course, you can position this hold down clamp on the left hand side and it will not get in the way of the housing of the motor or the saw. Even if you decide to turn it very much closer, it's just designed to not be in the way there. So if you decide to go over to the other side, just be careful you don't get in the way of the housing when you're cutting your lumber. I recently had to shave off some small pieces off of several 72 by 16 inch shelving panels that I was putting into a closet. And they are 16 inches in width. And the miter saw only cuts out to 12 inches. And I was too lazy to break out my table saw, so I decided to cut it, half of it first. So cut the first half, flip it over, and cut the second half. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So you notice what I'm doing here is I'm lining up the blade with this. And now that I've got that pretty much lined up, so now I've cut off this piece and it's pretty straight, but always make sure that you have some kind of support here. If you're cutting off a longer piece, you need to make sure you have support on the other side for this type of piece. But this way I've extended it. If you have a tendency, if you go all the way back here, you risk actually when you're flipping it over that your board either will crack or split off. So I typically go about halfway so I have plenty of board strength holding that in place. Sometimes you're going to be working with longer pieces of lumber and it's important that you support them correctly. So what I do in those cases is, first of all, I have the roller stands that I got from Harbor Freight. And then I also put additional support here so that as I'm moving the workpiece forward, I don't have to move my roller stand. And of course, I've done another piece of support here and then one on the other side. This gives you some stability. What you don't want is either piece, either the left or the right of the saw, to shift or move during the cutting process so that either you have a bad cut and or you have some kind of dangerous situation. If you're going to be doing any kind of precision work, you need to make sure that from the factory your blade and your saw is aligned correctly. Now, I have this unplugged so I feel comfortable doing this. So you can take the blade guard up, get yourself a small triangle square, and bring the blade down and make sure that the blade is actually perpendicular to the table that you're working on. Okay? So the next thing you want to do is you want to make sure this is perpendicular. When it says 0 degrees here, that's exactly what it is. So you can set this on this side or set it on the other side to make sure it's aligned. Now this, from this standpoint, this saw came from the factory pretty much in line, at least good enough for the work that I'm doing. Then you can bring it over here to 45 degrees and lock it in place. And then what you want to do is the same thing over here. Make sure that all your alignment's there. If you find it's a little bit off, then what you can do is adjust it here. Use your triangle square to make sure that it's correct, and then lock it down here. So I'm going to bring this back to the center. I've already loosened this up back here, and I'm going to take it over to the supposedly 45 degrees. I don't do an awful lot of 45 degree work, and again, I have this unplugged. So you can take this, bring it back, expose your blade, and make sure that it's at 45 degrees. In my case, it's not. So there are two adjustments on this right-hand side over here. So I'm going to bring the camera over. Let's take a look. There are two adjustments right here that are the stops for this bevel. So you can use those to adjust this. I'm not going to take the time to do it on mine right now for you. It's pretty simple and straightforward. So you need to make sure that your saw is pretty much in alignment. If it's not, then you need to adjust it for the type of work that you're going to be doing. Well, it's now time for me to clean up the sawdust. But before I go, I always want to point out, make sure you read, understand, and apply all the operational and safety instructions in your manual. Make sure you have eye protection and ear protection. I had both every time I was making a cut with this saw. I always have them both. So if you found this video useful, please press like, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. And as always, good luck on your projects.